The Eastern Front, winter of 1942. The land was buried beneath an ocean of ice and ash. The German advance, once unstoppable, had frozen in place. Engines coughed and died in the cold. Steel groaned beneath layers of frost. Soldiers huddled in white wastelands, waiting for orders that no longer came. And from the north, from the forests of the Valdai Hills, came the sound of Soviet artillery, the slow, relentless drumbeat of encirclement. Amid the blizzard stood a small town on the Lovett River, Kholm. Once insignificant, it now became the center of one of the most brutal sieges in human history. In January 1942, after the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow, the Red Army surged westward. The German lines cracked like ice under a hammer. Isolated units found themselves surrounded, cut off, freezing, and forgotten. One such group was the Kholm garrison, a mixed force of roughly 5,000 men, soldiers, Luftwaffe ground crews, SS and police units under the command of General Theodor Scherer. By January 23rd, the Soviets closed the ring around Kholm. 6 divisions of the Red Army encircled them. The nearest German front line was more than 50 kilometers away. The Soviets believed they would crush the pocket within days. But Scherer's men had other plans. Inside the town, the defenders turned ruins into fortresses. Wooden houses became bunkers. Streets became killing zones. The snow was red with blood and black with smoke. Soviet artillery pounded the town day and night. Whole blocks vanished into craters. Yet, the Germans dug deeper. They had orders to hold at any cost. The temperature dropped below -30. Frostbite was as deadly as bullets. Weapons froze solid. Men wrapped their feet in rags soaked in oil just to keep the frost from eating their skin. Rations ran out. Horses were slaughtered and eaten raw. The smell of burning flesh and frozen blood hung in the air. General Scherer moved through the ruins daily, wrapped in a torn greatcoat, encouraging his men. His radio operator, half frozen, sent desperate messages to Army Group North. "We are surrounded. Ammunition almost gone. Request supply drop." The Luftwaffe answered. From the gray sky above came the drone of engines, the only lifeline the garrison had left. Junkers Jew, 52 transport planes, and Heinkel. He-111 bombers began flying low over Kholm, dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies by parachute. The Soviets fired at them relentlessly, but still they came. It was the first time in history that an army would be supplied entirely by air, a desperate gamble that later inspired the Luftwaffe's doomed airlift to Stalingrad. Down below, men scrambled into the open under fire to retrieve the falling supplies. Some parachutes drifted into Soviet lines, others landed in flames. But each crate meant another day of survival. The Soviets launched assault after assault. Entire battalions stormed the town, shouting, "Ura!" through the smoke. Machine guns rattled. Mortar shells burst in courtyards. The defenders counterattacked through holes blasted in walls, throwing grenades and Molotov cocktails. Every house changed hands 3, sometimes 4 times. At night, the snow glowed with fire. The screams of the wounded echoed across the frozen river. The dead froze where they fell, statues of ice staring into the darkness. And still, the defenders refused to surrender. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels began to hear reports of the stand at Kholm. He recognized its potential, not as a military victory, but as propaganda. The Kholm pocket became a symbol of German resilience. Newspapers called it a fortress of heroes. Scherer's name was broadcast across the Reich, but the truth inside the pocket was far from heroic. It was hell. By February, Sickness spread through the trenches. Typhus, dysentery, and frostbite crippled hundreds. There were no doctors left, only field medics with frozen hands and no morphine. Men began to hallucinate from hunger. One soldier wrote in his diary, "The snow is our blanket, the dead are our pillows." Every day the Soviets demanded surrender. Every day Scherer refused. "We hold Kholm," he radioed to headquarters, "because we must." As March approached, the snow melted slightly, turning the ground to mud and blood. The Soviet artillery never stopped. The Luftwaffe continued its dangerous drops. Of the 60 aircraft assigned, more than a dozen were shot down. Yet somehow, against all logic, the defenders endured. 105 days. That was how long Kholm would hold. But for now, in February 1942, surrounded by fire and ice, the defenders of Kholm stood alone, trapped in a world of snow, steel, and silence. The siege had just begun. By early February 1942, the town of Kholm had become a smoking wound in the middle of the Russian winter. What had once been a quiet provincial settlement was now nothing more than rubble and flame. From above, Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes photographed a gray patchwork of ruins and craters. The outlines of streets were gone, erased by shell fire. The Lovet River lay frozen, cracked and red from blood and shrapnel, and inside that circle of death, 5,000 German soldiers clung to survival under the command of General Theodor Scherer. Each day began the same way. At dawn, Soviet artillery rumbled from the forested ridges. Shells screamed through the air, slamming into what little remained of the town. The ground shook like an earthquake. Roof tiles, glass, and bricks rained down on half-frozen men who no longer flinched. After the barrage came the infantry, waves of Soviet soldiers advancing through smoke, their greatcoats blackened, rifles at the ready. The defenders waited until the last moment. Then the ruins came alive. Machine guns barked from cellars, rifles cracked from shattered attics, grenades rolled across snow and ice. The fighting was close, savage, and without mercy. A single burned house might change hands several times in one day. Each side left behind frozen corpses in the snowdrifts, limbs reaching toward the gray sky like twisted roots. For the men inside Kholm, the world had shrunk to a few hundred meters. They no longer talked about the war, only about survival, food, warmth, and sleep. They tore wood from houses to feed their fires. They boiled snow for water. When the wind shifted, the stench of death blew through the town. But amid the hopelessness, a sound would sometimes cut through the roar of artillery, the distant hum of engines high above the clouds. The Luftwaffe had not forgotten them. Each day, despite the weather and Soviet anti-aircraft fire, transport planes flew from airfields near Smolensk and Vitebsk, attempting to drop supplies to Kholm. The operation was primitive and perilous. The air crews had to descend through blizzards and smoke to just a few hundred meters, then push crates out the cargo doors by hand. Some drops missed the pocket entirely, landing behind Soviet lines. Others burst open on impact, scattering food and ammunition across the snow. But even a single crate could mean life for a dozen men. They caught the parachutes as if catching salvation. A package of bread was worth more than gold. A can of meat was a feast. When medical kits arrived, they were divided like sacred relics. Soldiers shared morphine needles, splitting rations with comrades who could no longer walk. At night, the pocket glowed faintly under the northern lights. The outlines of wrecked vehicles shimmered beneath drifting snow. Somewhere beyond the lines, The Red Army prepared again. General Scherer's radio crackled endlessly. Orders, requests, promises of relief. Army Group North swore that a breakout was being organized, but in Kholm, promises meant nothing. Only the cold and the shells were real. The Soviets brought in fresh units, Siberian troops hardened by the cold. They swarmed across the river ice, carrying flamethrowers and grenades. They screamed, "Ura!" as they rushed forward, their white camouflage blending with the snow. The defenders, exhausted and frostbitten, fired until their machine guns jammed. They fought with bayonets, shovels, and even stones when ammunition ran out. One night, a Soviet shell struck a makeshift field hospital. The roof collapsed, burying the wounded. Flames rose into the black sky. There were no screams, only a deep muffled roar as the fire devoured everything inside. Men outside watched in silence, unable to move. Some prayed, others simply turned away. And still, the Luftwaffe came. The pilots called it the Kholm Run. It was considered a death sentence, flying at low altitude over enemy territory through flak and blizzards. Many never returned. But those who made it back wrote of what they saw: a wasteland dotted with fires, a single German flag fluttering in the ruins. Among them was pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel, already known for his courage on the Eastern Front. His squadron flew missions directly over the pocket, strafing Soviet positions to relieve pressure on the garrison. "It was like flying over the edge of hell," he later wrote. "The smoke, the flashes, the endless white, and below it, men clinging to life with nothing but willpower." Inside the pocket, Scherer became a figure out of myth. He walked the front lines with a pistol in his hand, encouraging his men by name. When radio contact failed, he sent runners, teenagers, policemen, even wounded men dragging themselves through rubble. They carried messages written on scraps of paper, stained with mud and blood. By March, over half the garrison was dead or wounded. But something extraordinary happened. The men stopped counting. There was no talk of surrender. They fought because there was no other choice. The Soviets tightened the ring. They built trenches around the pocket, artillery pits and observation posts. They watched every movement. They believed the end was near. Yet every morning, when the fog lifted, they still saw that same tattered German flag flying over the ruins. Kholm refused to die. In Berlin, Scherer's name became legend. The regime praised his defense, comparing it to Verdun and Thermopylae. But inside the pocket, there was no glory, only frost, blood, and exhaustion. The siege dragged on into March, then April. The snow began to melt, revealing hundreds of bodies stiff and pale beneath the ice. The air reeked of rot and cordite. Supplies dwindled again. The men were living ghosts, eyes sunken, fingers black with frostbite. And yet, the order remained. Hold the town, no matter the cost. The question was not how long they could fight. The question was how long they could remain human. The Battle of Kholm had entered its darkest phase. March 1942. The winter had begun to loosen its grip, but the thaw brought no relief to Kholm. The snow turned to black slush, the frozen corpses began to soften, and the stench of decay rolled across the shattered town. The defenders, what was left of them, moved like ghosts through the ruins. Their uniforms were in tatters, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. For 2 months they had lived under constant bombardment. The Soviets had surrounded the pocket so tightly that every breath of wind carried the echo of gunfire. The Germans could hear the Red Army digging trenches just meters away. They could smell the smoke of Soviet campfires at night, could even hear their laughter sometimes. The enemy was everywhere, above, around, and within the dark edges of their minds. Food was the first to vanish. By now there was nothing left to eat but crumbs from the last airdrops. The few horses that had survived the initial bombardment had long since been slaughtered. Even the dogs had disappeared, either killed for food or shot to keep them from giving away positions. In their place, rats scurried through the ruins. Men caught them, roasted them on sticks, and ate them whole. Ammunition was running out too. Soldiers cleaned and reused Soviet cartridges. Some carried captured Mosin-Nagant rifles scavenged from the dead. Mortar shells were so rare that each one was treated like gold. When they fired a shell, men whispered short prayers before pulling the trigger, as if the weapon itself needed convincing to keep fighting. The Luftwaffe's resupply missions grew less frequent. The weather had worsened again, and Soviet anti-aircraft positions had been strengthened. Only a few planes made it through each week. When the drone of an engine echoed across the gray sky, every man stopped and looked up. They would rush out into the open, ignoring the danger, waiting for the falling parachutes. Sometimes they caught them mid-air, sometimes they fought over them like starving animals. General Theodor Scherer watched his men with a quiet, grim resolve. His face had aged years in weeks. He no longer spoke of victory, only of endurance. He moved among his troops, speaking softly, patting shoulders, promising that relief would come. But in his heart, he wasn't sure anymore. Every message from headquarters promised a breakout soon. Yet, every promise dissolved into silence. The Soviets attacked again in early March. This time, they brought tanks. T-34s rolling through the melted streets, tracks clattering over debris. German soldiers fired Panzerfausts and grenades from cellars, waiting until the tanks were almost on top of them. Explosions tore open the ground. A T-34 burst into flames, its crew screaming inside as it burned. The smell of gasoline and flesh filled the air. Another tank crushed a barricade, firing point blank into a ruined building. The blast blew out walls and sent snow and blood into the street. Day after day, the Soviets pushed closer. The defenders fell back into smaller and smaller positions. The town had become a maze of trenches and tunnels. They called it Die Festung Kholm, the fortress of Kholm. But there was nothing left that resembled a fortress, only ruins, ash, and men too stubborn to die. Inside one cellar, a group of paratroopers shared a final can of condensed milk. They passed it around wordlessly, each man taking a small spoonful. No one spoke. Above them, artillery thundered. One soldier began humming an old marching tune, barely audible over the noise. Another joined in, and soon the room filled with a strange, haunting chorus, half song, half prayer. When night fell, the Soviets launched another attack. Flare guns lit up the sky, casting ghostly shadows over the ruins. Red Army soldiers surged forward, shouting, bayonets glinting in the light. The defenders fired until their barrels glowed. Then, when ammunition ran out, they fought hand to hand. Bayonets met shovels, rifles became clubs. The snow turned to mud and blood. By dawn, the Soviets withdrew again, leaving piles of bodies in the streets. The Germans were too weak to bury them. They dragged the corpses into heaps and covered them with broken wood and ice. The town smelled of rot and oil. Scherer wrote one final message to headquarters. Kholm stands. Supplies insufficient. Morale holding. God help us. The radio operator sent it through the static, unsure if anyone still listened. April came, bringing rain and fog. The snow finally melted, revealing what the winter had hidden. Hundreds of frozen soldiers, both German and Soviet, lay half buried in the earth. Their faces stared upward, eyes glassy, as if still searching for the sky. The once frozen river became a swamp of debris, helmets, weapons, fragments of human remains. Soviet artillery now fired from every direction. Shells whistled through the air, striking anything that still stood. The sound was constant, deafening, endless. Sleep became impossible. Men collapsed where they stood, only to be jolted awake by explosions. Some lost their minds completely. A medic shot himself after treating a dozen amputations in a single day. Another soldier walked out into the open, arms raised, laughing as the Soviets cut him down. And still, Kholm did not fall. The Luftwaffe managed one major drop in mid-April, delivering crates of ammunition, food, and a small miracle, mail from home. Soldiers wept as they read letters from wives and children written months before. Most of those families would never know if their messages were received. That night, Scherer gathered his surviving officers in a basement lit by a single candle. His voice was calm but heavy. "They will try again soon," he said. "We must endure until relief arrives. Remember, the world is watching. Kholm must hold above them. Thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from Soviet guns. The siege had entered its fourth month. The men had become shadows, but shadows, it seemed, could still fight." April 1942. The Kholm pocket had been encircled for nearly 3 months. Spring was returning to Russia, but in the ruins of that little town, the season brought no warmth, only more mud, more sickness, and more death. The snow was gone now, replaced by a foul, stinking swamp of melted ice, blood, and rotting flesh. Every street was a trench, every cellar a tomb. General Theodor Scherer's men had become hollow-eyed remnants of an army. Out of the 5,000 who had entered the pocket in January, barely 2,000 could still fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or delirious from hunger. The radio crackled with faint voices. Headquarters promised again that a relief force was on its way. But those words had come for weeks. The men no longer believed in rescue. The Soviets had grown tired of waiting. They wanted the town crushed before the thaw turned the roads into rivers of mud. On April 21st, under a gray, rain-choked sky, they launched their greatest assault yet. The artillery began at dawn, a rolling barrage that lasted hours. The earth trembled. The town vanished beneath dust and smoke. Buildings that had somehow survived the winter collapsed one after another. When the shelling finally stopped, the Soviet infantry advanced, hundreds of men moving across the open fields, shouting through the mist. Behind them came flamethrower teams and light tanks. The defenders had little left to fight with, only a few machine guns and rifles, most clogged with mud. Yet they fired until their barrels smoked, until they could see the whites of the attackers' eyes. The battle dissolved into chaos. Soviet soldiers burst through the outer defenses, storming cellars and trenches. German grenades exploded among them, tearing bodies apart. Men wrestled in the mud, stabbing, clawing, choking one another. Blood mixed with the rain, turning the ground into something black and glistening. Scherer himself fought with a pistol in his hand. His uniform was covered in grime, his face gaunt and gray. He shouted orders through the din, moving from one shattered position to the next. "Hold the line! Don't give them the town!" he cried, his voice hoarse and nearly gone. For hours the Soviets pressed forward. For hours the defenders refused to break. And then, slowly, the attack faltered. The Soviet infantry, cut down by the last surviving machine guns, began to withdraw. They left behind piles of dead in the ruins. The garrison had held once again, but at a price too terrible to count. That night, silence fell over Kholm. Rain dripped through shattered ceilings. Somewhere in the darkness, a soldier played a harmonica, the soft tune floating over the ruins like smoke. Men sat in the mud, staring at nothing. They no longer spoke of home. They no longer spoke of victory. High above, the sky flickered with lightning. The Luftwaffe made another attempt. 3 Ju-52 transports flew low over the pocket, their engines echoing across the rain-soaked plains. Tracers reached up from Soviet lines, stitching the sky with fire. One plane burst into flames, spiraling down into the forest. Another managed to drop its cargo. Crates that landed hard, breaking open to reveal ammunition, bread, and a single crate of cigarettes. The men cheered weakly. Those cigarettes were shared like communion. Each man took one and smoked in silence, the glow of the embers flickering across their hollow faces. For a few moments they looked almost human again. Beyond the ring, German relief columns were finally on the move. The 218th Infantry Division, supported by armored elements, had begun to push eastward through the mud. Every kilometer was a battle, ambushes, mines, collapsing bridges. The Soviets knew the relief was coming, and they threw everything they had to stop it. Back in Kholm, Scherer's men waited. The constant rain made the ground impassable. The wounded lay in flooded trenches, their bandages soaked in blood and water. Some begged for morphine that no longer existed. Others simply closed their eyes and slipped away. By late April, the Soviets launched one final offensive. The attack came at night, under cover of fog. Flares lit the sky in eerie white flashes. Machine guns chattered. Soviet troops poured into the southern edge of the pocket, screaming as they charged. They overwhelmed a forward trench, bayonets flashing. The defenders counterattacked, hurling grenades and firing blindly into the smoke. General Scherer moved among them, his voice barely audible above the storm of battle. "You are the wall between the enemy and the fatherland," he told a young soldier trembling with fear. "You will not fall." The boy nodded and returned to his post. Hours later, his body was found in the same spot, his rifle still in his hands. When dawn came, the attack was over. The Soviets had withdrawn again, leaving the pocket still unbroken. The ground was covered in bodies, German and Russian, tangled together in death. The survivors stared at the rising sun with blank eyes. By the beginning of May, the sound of distant artillery began to change. For the first time in months, the thunder of guns came not from every direction, but from one. The relief force was close. Men climbed onto the rooftops and listened. They could hear it, the faint rumble of engines, the deep pounding of German artillery advancing westward. Hope, that fragile ghost, flickered back to life. On May 5th, the small patrol broke through the Soviet lines and entered Kholm. They were covered in mud, their faces black with soot, but they carried the flag of the 218th Division. The defenders watched in silence as the soldiers approached. No one cheered, no one spoke. There was only exhaustion and disbelief. After 105 days of siege, the Kholm pocket had been relieved. When the relief force entered the town, they found men who looked like skeletons. Their skin was gray, their hands shaking uncontrollably. They could barely walk. Out of the original 5,000, only a fraction remained alive. But they had done the impossible. They had held. General Scherer stood in the ruins as the first reinforcements arrived. He saluted them, his arm trembling. "Kholm is free," he said quietly. Then he turned away and wept. The longest night was over, but for the men who survived, the war would never truly end. May 1942. The siege of Kholm was over, but what remained could hardly be called a victory. The small town on the Lovett River was little more than a graveyard. Streets erased by shell fire, roofs caved in, and walls pockmarked by endless bullets. The smell of death clung to every corner, a stench so deep it seemed part of the air itself. The relief troops moved through the ruins in silence. They had expected to find a fortress, a last stand. What they found instead were ghosts. Men whose faces were pale as ash, eyes sunken into black hollows. Some saluted weakly as their comrades entered, others simply stared through them, their minds far away. There was no joy, no cheering, only disbelief that they were still breathing. General Theodor Scherer, the man who had commanded the garrison through 105 days of isolation, stood among the wreckage, his uniform torn and filthy, his eyes red from exhaustion. He had lost nearly everything: friends, soldiers, even parts of his own sanity. The Iron Cross hung from his neck, but it felt heavier than ever before. When the order came to evacuate the wounded and rejoin Army Group North, he looked back at Kholm one last time. "No one will believe what happened here," he murmured, and he was right. The survivors were taken out through muddy tracks, past burning forests and shattered vehicles. They were greeted as heroes by the German High Command, paraded before cameras and newspapers as proof of German endurance. The word Helden von Kholm, heroes of Kholm, became a symbol of resistance, but behind the propaganda reels and the triumphant headlines, the truth was darker. Most of the men were too broken to understand what heroism meant anymore. They were given food, warm uniforms, and rest, yet even in safety, they could not escape what they had seen. They woke screaming in the night, haunted by visions of the siege, the endless shelling, the bodies frozen in the streets, the sound of planes that never came. Some refused to speak at all, others begged to return to the front, unable to live away from the war that had consumed them. The Kholm pocket became a legend within the Wehrmacht. Its defense was used in speeches and propaganda films to show the unbreakable spirit of the German soldier. Posters bore Scherer's image, praising his courage. But in private, he was a man destroyed by what he had endured. His letters to his wife spoke of guilt and sleeplessness, of the men who died begging for water or morphine he could not give. "I hear them still," he wrote, "in every silence." On the Soviet side, Kholm was remembered differently. For the Red Army, it was a bitter wound, a small victory denied despite overwhelming force. Thousands of Soviet soldiers had died trying to crush that pocket. Many were left unburied, their bodies lost to the mud and snow. For the villagers who later returned, the land was cursed. Bones still surfaced every spring. Years passed and the front lines moved on. The great tides of war swept toward Kursk, toward Stalingrad, toward Berlin. Kholm became a footnote, a minor siege in a war of giants. But for those who had been there, it was the center of the world. In the post-war years, the survivors of Kholm tried to rebuild their lives in a Germany that no longer existed. Some joined veterans groups, others withdrew into silence. When they met, they spoke little of glory. They talked instead of hunger, of the faces of comrades who had vanished in the snow. "We didn't fight for victory," one veteran said in an interview decades later. "We fought because we couldn't die yet." General Scherer lived quietly after the war, refusing all offers to write memoirs or appear in documentaries. When asked about Kholm, he simply said, "It was hell." That's all. He died in 1951, his final years spent in solitude. In modern Kholm, the scars remain. The town was rebuilt, but beneath its streets lie the bones of thousands, German and Soviet alike. Every few years, excavation teams uncover rusted helmets, dog tags, and fragments of uniforms. The local cemetery holds a single memorial stone. To the fallen of both armies, 1942. If you stand there today, the wind still moves through the birch trees that line the Lovett River. The water flows quietly, as it did then, beneath the same gray sky. The war is gone, but its echo lingers, faint, eternal. Operation Barbarossa had begun with dreams of conquest, of a lightning victory that would break the Soviet Union in months. But Kholm was the truth of that war, the grinding, merciless endurance, the suffering that devoured both sides. A place where courage and despair became indistinguishable. In the end, the siege of Kholm was not about who won or lost. It was about survival, the raw, brutal will to exist when everything else had fallen away. The men who held that pocket were not heroes in the shining sense. They were human beings caught in a machine too vast to comprehend, clutching their rifles in the dark, praying for dawn that seemed never to come. And when that dawn finally broke, after 105 days of night, it revealed what war truly was. Not glory, not honor, but endurance, sacrifice, and the terrible price of obedience. Kholm stands as a whisper from the past, carried on the cold wind of history. It reminds us that behind every victory and defeat, there are men, hungry, cold, afraid, trying only to stay alive. And perhaps that more than anything else is what makes their story unforgettable.